Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to listen to my talk today. I'm excited to teach everybody about some things that kind of I wish I knew earlier in my career, and I'm excited to share with everybody who's interviewing currently and who will be soon. So let's dive right in. Can everybody see my screen? Kaizen, maybe thumbs up. Okay. So everybody, welcome to Design Thinking for UX Interviews. So as Kaizen mentioned, my name is Josh Gold and I'm a product designer at LinkedIn. You kind of got my overview from Kaizen. So I'll add kind of one bit, which is kind of what makes me qualified to speak about UX interviewing. First, I'm involved in interviewing at LinkedIn. I have been involved in hiring from many of my previous roles. Specifically, I've had a lot of experience interviewing. And I think most of my skills that I've picked up interviewing have been through actually going through it. And I'll speak a little about that towards the end of the presentation. So let's start and dive right in. So what is design thinking? I know I threw design thinking in the title and it was a really catchy slogan, design thinking for UX interviews. But before we explain why you can apply it to UX interviews, it's worth taking the time to actually understand what design thinking is. As you can see here, it says design thinking is an iterative process in which we seek to understand the user, challenge assumptions, and redefine problems in an attempt to identify alternative strategies and solutions that might not be instantly apparent with our initial level of understanding. So design thinking is pretty much understanding kind of all of our assumptions and using research to understand those assumptions, then challenging them, redefining them, and constantly iterating to create interesting solutions for those assumptions. Now we get to how it can actually be applied to interviewing. Well, design thinking, if you think about it, isn't something that can only be applied to our design process of creating software. It's almost similar to like any scientific method where you approach problems, you try to identify them, explore interesting solutions, and over time improve. That same process of understanding kind of the process of interviewing, understanding what the hiring people want to hear and are looking for you to explain to them, paying attention to the process and the assumptions that you take for granted, and then over time iterating on those assumptions will allow you to improve over time. So during this presentation, I've broken it into 4 parts. The first is the interview process. So we'll go over a high level of like what you can expect if you're going into an interview. This is perhaps the most average UX interview process. So, it may be specific depending on where you are interviewing, but this should cover the basics. Then we'll talk about getting ready to apply. So what do you need to have in order to apply to, a UX position? And how can you maximize that? How can you continuously hone that? And then we'll talk about you, the candidate. So we'll go into a little bit about, what kind of stories you want to know about yourself. We'll want to know about what stories you're trying to tell to your interviewer. And we'll dive into the process of developing that persona of, who you want to be in order to get hired. And then 4, we'll review case studies. Perhaps, in my opinion, the most important part of interviewing is your actual UX skills. And, case studies are how you can display those skills. So learning how to maximize those will make you a much stronger design candidate. Now, at the end of every section, we're going to have a small design thinking section, which will teach you how to apply design thinking to the things previously listed in the chapters. So to start, the interview process. For those of you that don't know, this might be a lot of information. For those of you that do know, bear with me. So first off, here's an interview timeline. It starts with a resume and portfolio. This is where you put together a resume of your experience and your achievements, or a LinkedIn profile with the same thing. You'll also craft a portfolio that lists a few end-to-end case studies of work that you've previously worked on. If you submit that and the recruiter decides to reach out to you, they'll probably schedule a phone interview. The phone interview will be a recruiter or maybe someone at the company calling you and trying to verify your experience. Is everything on your resume accurate? Were you perhaps telling the truth about everything, or was something a little confusing, and they'll just want to verify your information. Once you go through that, they'll move you on to the case study interview. Normally this happens over Zoom, where you'll be asked to present 1 to 2 of your case study projects. Normally it will be with either a hiring manager or just a general designer at whatever company you're interviewing for. That will differ based on how large the company is. And then if you succeed in that stage, you'll move on to the on-site interview, which pre-corona was in person, now over Zoom, where you'll have the opportunity to speak with a few different designers from the company. You'll have the opportunity to present probably another project or case study that you've worked on. And you'll also potentially be asked to do like a whiteboarding challenge, or maybe present a design challenge that they've asked for. If you do really well there, then you get a big bag of money and you get to go home and celebrate. And you get a job. So that's the general interview timeline. And moving forward, we'll break down those parts a little bit more in order to better understand what makes up all those different components. And design thinking for the whole process. So before we go into the specifics of how you can apply design thinking to all of those stages that I've previously mentioned, I want to set a high level context to how you could think about applying design thinking. So if you look at those 4 different stages of interviewing as steps, each step comes with its own opportunity to learn. So you're going to be in that initial phone call and you're going to be talking to a recruiter, and the first couple of times it may not go well, but if you can pay attention and learn about what you can do to better you kind of structure your phone interviewing skills, then you'll be able to move on to the second round, and you'll be able to do that same thing. Pay attention of what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, then come back, reiterate, and try again. And then you'll get to the third stage. And that kind of process can be iterative through your entire interviewing narrative. So now let's talk about you, the candidate. You're getting ready to apply. Everyone may know it's pretty simple. You need a resume. I would recommend a LinkedIn. You also need a portfolio. LinkedIn specifically, I'm a little biased here, but it both allows you to be passively recruited by recruiters, meaning instead of just applying to all of your jobs, you might have people from specific companies that can actually reach out to you and say, hey, we think that your profile is a good fit for this job opportunity. But also it's kind of a great way for recruiters to just really easily scan your information and your experience. So oftentimes recruiters now seem to be looking at LinkedIn's a little bit more than even resumes. So just to talk about general like resume / LinkedIn like formatting. First off, experience is really important. Obviously, that's what you want to get out of a resume. But what's most important is that even if you don't have that experience, you might be a student, you might be new to UX design, kind of every experience can be crafted to be experience. You need to figure out how to better structure that narrative to show that you have skills that are applicable and that you can apply them to this job that you're applying to. You should highlight your achievements and metrics if possible. Oftentimes I look at resumes and I see I can wireframe, or at my job, I did research. That doesn't tell a lot about how you applied those skills and doesn't allow us to properly measure whether you'd be a good fit for our company. So if you can root it in achievements, it'll be a much more concrete resume. An example of that would be I used wireframing to develop a new onboarding flow for our application, thereby increasing users onboarding by 5%, right? That's a really strong narrative. And as much as possible, you want to have those strong narratives. You also should keep it on one page. So a recruiter once told me that you should have one page for your resume for every 10 years of experience. So unless you've been a designer for 10 years, you shouldn't just overload your resume with everything that you've done. You need to figure out what is most important, how to best communicate that, and then fit it all on one page. Also, typography and hierarchy really matter. So this is your first impression as a designer, and UI skills are really important if you are trying to be a UX or UI designer. So you need to make sure that your typography skills and your hierarchy skills on your resume are on point. Now, that doesn't mean doing anything fancy. Oftentimes people want to add a lot of flair and colors and be like, I'm very creative. And I think that from my experience, what I found to be most important is that it just needs to be very usable. It needs to be easy for a recruiter to read, and you should show those skills in order to make it usable. Now just talk a little bit about LinkedIn specifically. These are some tips that I learned from a LinkedIn recruiter on the design team that will make it easier for people to find you, as well as help you better leverage LinkedIn. First is make it as easy as possible for hiring managers and recruiters to find your portfolio. You'd be surprised how often people will apply to roles with maybe a portfolio on their resume, but not on their LinkedIn. Or if it's on their LinkedIn, it's almost difficult to find. And that's a lot of friction for a recruiter who's only looking at your portfolio for a very brief amount of time. So what we recommended at LinkedIn is to add your portfolio in the About Me section of your LinkedIn portfolio, or the portfolio specific feature that we actually have where you can just display kind of an icon for your portfolio and it can be easily found and clicked on. You also want to keep LinkedIn up to date with important information. We see often that people are updating their resumes with content, but not their LinkedIn. First, you're missing an opportunity because recruiters are looking at your LinkedIn. But also, if there's a mismatch between the two, then it leaves the recruiter kind of confused. And again, that's additional friction that they may not be looking to address. So they may just pass on that opportunity, or they're going to have to clarify it later in your interviewing journey, which is just not ideal. And most importantly, recruiters only spend a minute or so on the LinkedIn profile, but also on your resume. So this fact is kind of out of context. It doesn't seem very important, but later as we begin to address what will benefit you the most by putting work into, it will become important when you compare it to where you should work. Should it be on a resume or should it be for your portfolio? Some more tips. Open to opportunity setting enables recruiter to better find you. So you may have seen those open to opportunity circles on a profile, also on a badge. If that's not turned on, you're going to be missing out. Adding keywords such as end-to-end, user research, and other standard keywords are really important because oftentimes in the LinkedIn recruiter, people will search for keywords and they'll search on your profile for keywords. So if you want to draw their attention to your achievements, find ways to show that kind of the lingo. And LinkedIn referrals matter. So you'd be surprised how powerful referrals are. If you know somebody in a company, or you even know somebody who knows somebody in a company, you should reach out and try to socialize and see if eventually they might be able to refer you. Now, this doesn't mean just sending some random stranger a message that says, hey, my name is Josh Gold. Can you refer me to this job? Because people aren't going to like that. You want to try to show that you're personable, that you care about this person, that they're not just a tool for you to achieve your job. Maybe do some research on them, maybe see if they've written anything, and then include that in your message to show that you've kind of put forward a lot of effort in reaching out. And now portfolio, arguably the most important aspect of applying. Recruiter and hiring managers spend the most time on your portfolio. Your resume, they look at for only a minute or two, but your portfolio, they'll spend a lot more time on, as it's the best way to accurately judge your skills. So make sure that your portfolio is up to date. Put your best case study up front. So oftentimes it is important to have 3 to 4 case studies just to show that you have some experience. But that first case study is what everybody is going to look at. A recruiter is going to see your portfolio. They're going to click on that top case study. They're going to go in. And if they get everything that they're looking for, they'll say, great, I'm just going to pass this on to the hiring manager. And oftentimes not even go to number 2. If they didn't find what they were looking for in that first case study, they'll look at the second case study as well. So it is also important to have that prepared. End-to-end case studies are important. So oftentimes when I am reviewing portfolios, I see designers place just maybe a high fidelity image and say, this is the final image. Maybe they'll add some additional information. But what we want to see on portfolio is an end-to-end case study that shows that you know the design process and you are capable of applying it to real world projects, right? Not that I made wireframes or that I know how to make a user journey. I made wireframes to do this, and then it formed my design decision, so I moved it forward. End-to-end case studies are very important, and we'll go into that a little bit more soon as well. And again, typography and hierarchy say a lot. So just as your resume needs to be formatted properly, so does your portfolio. Again, I've found that you don't need to do anything fancy. If you do anything fancy, for sure that's a value add. But if you're adding a ton of flair before those case studies are ready, then I would say that's a misuse of your time, right? First, nail those case studies and then add some flair to your portfolio. That being said, if it's already there, that's amazing. It definitely helps you stand out. And if you add it, that's also another value add. Now, design thinking while applying, right? We're talking about how we could pay attention to the assumptions, learn from them, and tweak them over time. First is prioritize and test your case studies. So when I was applying, I would often switch around my case studies to figure out which case study would have the most impact. Is it my case study number one? Am I getting the most recruiter calls from it? No, let's put the third one on top. Maybe I want to sub in a different one from maybe a year ago. You can tweak that over time in order to A/B test which case study will get you the most interviews. Also, why is your recruiter confused? So if you are getting a phone call and maybe they are being mixed up about something that you said, something on your portfolio, jot that down, come back, fix it so that the next recruiter isn't confused. It doesn't really matter if maybe they said where you were confused and they still moved you forward. That's still an opportunity to fix that and put your best foot forward. And then how can you improve resume content or design, but also portfolio? So these things can always be improved, right? The narrative, the structure of your resume and design, as well as the content. You can constantly tweak that a little. If you're not seeing your case studies or your resume getting a lot of hits, try to improve the design, try to improve the layout, maybe even try to improve the content as we were talking about with resumes. Maybe you said, I changed this and did this. Maybe that wasn't the best way to phrase it. So you can always kind of play around with that and see what works best. Now let's talk about you, the candidate, your interviewing narrative. First, know your skill set. When you go into an interview, they already know, they sort of know who they want to hire, what skills they want to hire for. And it's just as important for you to understand your skill set in order that you can properly apply to a job. It's just as important for you to understand your skill set, because when you're applying to a job, it's not only about whether you are going to be a good fit for this job, it's also whether this job is going to be a good fit for you. So going into it and understanding where your strengths are and what your weaknesses are is really important. While I was interviewing, and still today, I group my skills into 5 different buckets. First is business strategy. So this is, as designers, we work quite closely with product managers, and we work quite closely with, business representatives of our company. Every project doesn't only have user goals, it also has business goals. So if I have a project and I am, say, designing an onboarding flow, there are clear business goals that we need to account for in order to build a successful product. And knowing why those business goals exist, how your product affects it, and how you can properly measure that will make you a stronger designer. You also have to worry about research. Now, every company is different, and not every company requires you to have strong research skills. But just being familiar with the processes, being familiar with how you can speak to users, if you ever do need to know research, that's also a really strong skill to have. Then obviously interaction design. So, are we using drop downs? Are you moving from this screen to that screen? One of the core tools in our UX tool belt is a really important skill. Then UI design, so your visual design skills is also really important. And then finally, your soft skills. This was a category that I added quite recently. Soft skills are those skills that allow you to properly collaborate with a bunch of different people. When you put 10 people in a room with different skill sets and different things that they value, it can be quite difficult to align everybody around a singular design. And being able to perfect those skills over time and understand what you need to improve on will make you a better designer. Now, what's your story? So during the interview process, you have a narrative. You have a type of candidate that you want to paint in order for your interviewer to understand why they should hire you. Certain things to pay attention to are the questions that they're going to ask you. They're going to ask you questions like, what was a moment of friction with your team? Meaning, what was one time you were working with those 10 people in that room and it didn't work out as expected, and maybe there was some trouble? And how did you circumnavigate that trouble? That's a really important skill to have as a UX designer because it comes up quite often. And those soft skills, in order to navigate those moments, are really important. So make sure that you have a story ready about a time you had a lot of friction with your team. Also, a time a project did not perform as planned. UX design is all about hypotheses. We don't know if we're going to be right when we build a product. We look at our assumptions and we do our research as best as possible, but we're not perfect. So it's important to remember that when you're being interviewed. Speak about a time when you built something and maybe it failed, and then you had learnings from it that you applied to a different project. That's core to our role as a UX designer, and companies want to hear that you can do that. And then talk about something you're proud of. We are creative people. We love what we do, or we try to love what we do. And if you have something that you're really passionate about, maybe a project or some sort of experience that you worked on that made you really proud to be part of it, speak about it, because that passion is really powerful. And we as hiring managers want to hear that. I'm not a hiring manager, but we do want to hear that. And finally, what makes you unique? Oftentimes, when I'm speaking to candidates, they come from different types of backgrounds. They could have been a marketing person or designer previously. They may have been an engineer. They may have been in sales, and they're now trying to become a UX designer. Now, those skills aren't as directly like correlated as maybe being a graphic designer first, but they're still really powerful because every single experience has an impact on your skills as a UX designer. If you're an engineer previously, then you understand how to better work with engineers. You understand how to take engineering restrictions into your designs. If you have sales experience, you might have a higher ability to empathize with people because you spend a lot of time talking to people or selling to people. If you've worked at a bar, if you worked in a restaurant industry, that's another example of like you may have a very strong level of empathy. And you can find ways to work that into your narrative to make you a much stronger UX candidate. Now, design thinking for your narrative. First is paying attention to the skills that you're talking about, right? We spoke about those 5 different buckets. Now, if we are talking, if we are talking in an interview about our skills in a certain way, and perhaps they're not being received as we thought they would. So maybe someone wants a UI designer. Maybe they thought your UI skills weren't as strong as you thought they were. Pay attention to those because when you're speaking to someone, you'll be able to see visual cues. You'll be able to see how they respond to questions. And you'll know where in your next interview to either tweak your narrative or try to improve one of your skills. For instance, if I'm maybe coming short in the UI department, I could try to do a design challenge a day in order to strengthen my visual skills so that the next time I apply, I won't have that same gap. And that's kind of the second one, which is should you be brushing up on a skill, right? If you're kind of lacking in one of those skills, especially some of the design ones, you can practice, and practice makes perfect. There are a lot of things that you can do on your own, from design challenges a day to maybe reading the Wall Street Journal and better understanding why businesses are maybe making certain types of decisions, why they're succeeding and why they're not. This is a real opportunity to not only better your interviewing skills, but also become a better designer. How are your experience stories coming across? So maybe you told a story about one time when you had friction with your teammates. Maybe that wasn't as much friction as you thought it was. Maybe that was too much friction. Pay attention to visual cues, pay attention to questions. Over time, you can tweak those stories, you can use different stories, and you can figure out what's going to be the most impactful. And then finally, how can you better highlight what makes you unique? I think this is one of the more difficult things to incorporate into your narrative because, if you don't have a lot of experience selling your skills as like whatever you were previously for a UX designer, you may not understand the best way to tell that narrative. So just try a lot of different ways. Work it into your story, maybe towards the beginning, why you chose to become a UX designer. Maybe work it into the end and be like, when I'm making, business decisions, this helps. Just tweak it, play with it, and over time, your story is going to grow a lot stronger. Now, case studies. This is kind of the meat of the presentation. This is the meat of interviewing. This is the phase that displays your skills as a designer, and it's worth putting a lot of effort into creating your case studies. So before we dig into like my advice and some tips as to how you could craft case studies, I wanted to highlight why we make people present case studies. First is it highlights your design decisions. So we can see if you are making decisions that we think are positive or negative. We could see if you're accounting for the variables that we think you should be. So for instance, if you say I made this decision, we can see, okay, that was a good decision. And we can now better gauge your skills. We also test your soft skills. So presenting as a designer is really, really important, whether you're presenting to your team or stakeholders, and they are going to be asking you questions about the design decisions you made, and how you respond to those design decisions will say a lot about your soft skills. And we're taking this small case study as an example of, if we were to hire you, how well would you be able to present and defend your design decisions. It also gauges your UI skills. This is something that I really struggled with when I was first crafting case studies. That little weird white bar in your design mockup, that one title header that's not aligned, we see that. We're paying a lot of attention to your UI skills. So be sure that you're addressing all of those gaps before you present. Try to make sure that you're choosing the proper typography and colors in order to best highlight your designs. And then finally, measures an ability to learn and grow. During this process of you presenting and us asking questions, we're watching you to see how you respond to certain things, and we're trying to understand your thought process. This not only tells us about the skills that you currently have, this is going to give us a really good idea of, if we were to hire you, do you have the potential to learn and grow more? So this is kind of why we choose to have designers present case studies. This is why I present case studies. Now, the big questions, that's why we're doing it. This is what we're going to ask you about those to like properly measure those things. We're going to say, are you creating solutions that make sense, right? So during your presentation, we want to be like, that was a good design decision, or that was a bad design decision, or maybe that was an interesting choice, and maybe you have a reason for it. We're also going to say, why did you choose certain solutions over the other? So if you present one solution, we're going to say, what about this? Have you thought about a different solution? Why is this one solution better than the other solution? And we're going to see if you can properly defend your decisions or accept critique. So it's okay not to have an answer for everything. We just want to see if you can properly say, I thought about this. I made these decisions with intent. I chose to put this button here. I chose to hook this screen up to that. If you can do that, that's amazing. We're going to watch that and we're going to appreciate it. Remember, again, we're not all perfect. We're not design gods. So remembering how to respond properly to critique that you may not have thought of, maybe taking the time to think about their question, and then respond with something like, that's a really good idea. I actually didn't think of that. Give a good reason why that's a good idea. And then kind of move on. And that's totally okay. That shows an ability to learn and grow. So now we spoke about the what and the why. Let's talk about what exactly is a case study. Case studies are end-to-end records of projects that you've previously worked on, meaning we are going to want to know exactly what you worked on. We're going to know the process of what decisions you made throughout that process, and we want to know what you ended up with. During this process of you presenting a case study, we're going to need to understand exactly how you got to assumption A all the way to UX choice B. So as you can see in this example here, there's almost a direct line. It's like a logic tree, and we're drawing a map of your decisions. And we want to be able to properly understand that map. So say in a case study and an end-to-end case study, you're going to tell us, I started with assumption A. Maybe it's from research, maybe not. We need to understand that assumption. What is the context that you're making that assumption in? That way, when you move to feature B, right, you say, okay, we chose to work on a specific feature. We understand assumption A, therefore we understand why you chose feature B. You drew a direct line, a correlation between assumption and feature. Also, it allows us to properly measure, I see why you chose feature B over feature A. right? There's no singular correct choice for a UX designer. It's our job to best choose to come up with creative solutions and see which solution best solves our problem. So if you chose feature B over feature A, you move that forward, and now you're making UX choice B over UX choice A. There are two things to pay attention to. First is the mapping of assumption A to assumption B, setting the proper context so that we can gauge your UX choice B question is really important. And second, it's showing alternatives, right? So presenting the fact that you came up with different solutions, UX choice A and UX choice B, allows us to gauge your skills and say, oh, I see why he chose UX choice B. UX choice A was a good solution, but he understands the assumptions. He understands what we were trying to create with the feature. Therefore, he made the correct choice and he made a good UX decision. Gaps in the narrative. This is probably the number one hole in case studies that I see, right? We spoke about drawing that map from assumption A to UX choice B, but what actually happens if you're not doing it properly? Say you don't paint that assumption A and you just skip to feature B. We're not going to be able to fully understand feature B. We're going to be lost. We're not going to ask you the right questions that we need to ask you in order to gauge your skills. We're not going to have the proper context to understand things further down the line, such as UX choice B. It's almost as if our confusion compounds after that narrative gap, so that we kind of start losing track at feature B. At UX choice B, we lose it even more. And then at UX choice C, we're completely lost. This is the most integral danger that you have when painting a case study. So make sure that you properly paint your assumptions, your decisions, your choices, all in a way that kind of maps you from the start to the end. What's the best way to do that? So that can be really complicated because in any UX project, you're making maybe hundreds of thousands of decisions. Maybe you're working on, a full application and you're the first designer to work on it, and you made, let's say, 20 different pages, and each page has like 50 different features. In 30 minutes, that's going to be really, really complicated to convey. And we're, again, not going to be able to understand that context of how you got from assumption A to UX choice B. So instead, you're going to want to write kind of your narrative like a novel, and you're going to want to straighten out that line so that we're not looking at an entire logic tree. We're looking at a straight line. You'll start with a company overview, right? What is the company that you're working for? You might say, I made a bank feature, but if we don't know that this is for a bank, or maybe there's a different context to it, that's a huge piece of the puzzle we're missing. Then you're going to talk about a project overview. Why are you working on this project? Who gave you this project? What assumptions are you making in this project? What was your role in this project, right? So a high level understanding of the project itself. Then you'll want to talk about the research and results, right? It's very important to be very clear with the assumptions that you're making during your case study. Meaning, if I say that we have found a problem in our research that our users are unclear as to how to add a bank account to our application, we want to then inform all of the next decisions down the line with that assumption. So every choice you make needs to be, we're making this because it allows our users to better add a bank account. And if you don't properly show that assumption that we want to make it easier for users to add their bank account, and you don't show the research, like why have you come to that assumption, we're going to be missing a giant chunk of the context. Now, sometimes it comes up, especially if you are maybe an intern or you're newer in your career, you may not have done the research, and that's okay. State where your research comes from. Was it handed off to you by a different partner? Maybe you did online research. Not every startup can afford to actually send out somebody to do hands-on research. It's okay. Just state where you're getting your assumptions from and why you're making them. After that, you can move on to high-level decisions, right? We'll talk about user journeys, maybe some wireframes, more high fidelity, and always map it back to that assumption. So that if you're showing us a wireframe, it's not necessarily here's a wireframe, it's here's a wireframe. where I tried to solve the problem of users are not able to add a bank account. Always map it back to that assumption. At that point, once you've set the context for the user journey and the wireframes, you can then talk about user interface design. You can talk about the typography choices you made. You can talk about why did you use a design system? Did you create a design system? Maybe there were some cool like hover effects that you made, some interactions. That's the place to talk about it. Not before you've set all that context, not skipping that context. Because if you don't properly set your previous, like these 4 points previously, then we're not going to really understand why you chose to put a button on the left side of the screen or the right side of the screen. Maybe a button is a bad example because that's basic interaction design. But for instance, we're not going to understand why you chose to place something at the top of an information architecture hierarchy or at the bottom. So make sure that you're writing your case study like a novel and you're hitting all of these points. Now, some really important tips for crafting a case study. If you can't explain it, it doesn't matter. Oftentimes, software can be complex. Maybe there's some cool algorithms that are running on the back ends. Maybe there were some really complicated problems that you ran into. If you see that you're having a hard time presenting it, people aren't understanding it, I would say either like see if you could fix it, but if you can't, kind of just drop it and build a narrative around that really complicated point. If you can't explain it properly, then forget about it. Somebody listening to your presentation in 30 minutes with no context previously is not going to understand it, and it's going to kind of cause us to become completely lost. Focus on UX decisions and not tools. This is something I see quite often in people's portfolios, and that's they'll say, I made wireframes, and we used wireframes to inform what feature we would build. Here are the wireframes. That's completely missing the mark, right? Because we want to gauge your design skills, and those design skills can be gauged if you're setting the assumption and you're telling us why you're making design decisions. Perhaps you're even telling us why you're choosing one thing over the other. So just quickly summarizing, I used a tool isn't really going to hit the mark here. You want to say how you use that tool. I used wireframes to figure out this problem, and I figured it out, and we moved it on to the next stage. In presentations, make sure to show alternatives. Again, it's really important because it allows us to gauge your skills. We want to see that you're making certain decisions with intent. And if you can show, hey, I explored 2 different iterations, one solved these problems, the second solved a separate set of problems or the same set of problems, and we moved forward with option A because of X, Y, and Z reason, we're actually seeing the logic that you're putting into your own work. That's the logic that you're going to put into our projects if we hire you. So alternatives is a great way to demonstrate your UX skills. And then finally, talking to yourself is not weird. Even before this presentation, I was in a mirror and I was rehearsing this. Allowing yourself to kind of just run through your presentation might highlight some gaps in that narrative. Maybe you're skipping from something, you're skipping an assumption. Maybe you are like, oh, I actually should include a step that, maybe before I explain what case studies are, I should add a slide that says case studies. And here's a good point to talk about why I'm going to talk about case studies. So rehearse. It's really helpful and I highly recommend it. Now, design thinking for your case study. How do you improve your case study over time? First is, are your interviewers getting confused? As you run through your case study, you are going to receive the maximum amount of feedback. People are literally going to be there. They're going to be asking you questions about points they're confused on. Try to remember those, because when you go home at the end of the day, you can write those down and you can fix them for your next case study, so that the next time you interview, you don't have to spend time explaining to your interviewers that, well, I chose to add this feature because of X, Y, and Z. You've already said it. So pay a lot of attention to where your interviewers are getting confused. Then how well do you answer questions and critique? Receiving and combating critique is an art, right? It's really, really hard to be criticized. And oftentimes when you are criticized, you can almost become nervous. You might say something that you didn't mean to. You might almost rush to say an answer and then 30 seconds later be like, oh, I wish I didn't say that. That's okay. Receiving and answering critiques and interviewing is something that you can improve on over time. So pay attention and say, ooh, I answered that question too fast. Next time I need to think about it. Or say, maybe I didn't accept critique as well as I could have. Maybe when they said you should have thought about this, I got nervous and I just said something that off the cuff. Come up with an answer and say, you're right. That's a really good point. I think that would definitely inform our decisions. So you can critique and hone how you answer your questions over time. And did you receive any feedback from your interview? You can definitely ask your interviewers if they're willing to share feedback. Oftentimes they may not, but sometimes they'll surprise you and they might actually send back some thoughts that their interviewers had during your presentation. This is a gold mine of feedback. Ask for it, treasure it, and incorporate it into your presentation. Now, other applications, right? During that design process, you might be asked to do whiteboarding. You may have a design project that they'll give you a certain amount of days to do it. So let's talk a little bit about that. You know, it doesn't really matter. This narrative that I kind of told you, this logic tree of choosing one decision over the other because of a specific assumption, this is the design process. This is design thinking. And that same design thinking can and should be applied to whiteboarding. It should be applied to design challenges. Now, again, there's a 10% that does differ because there are specific tips and tricks to learning how to become better at whiteboarding and design presentations. But go Google it, because designers have been adding content to Medium about whiteboarding for Facebook for like a decade. So remember, during this process, apply that same design narrative, but then also learn how to best structure it in these specific interview situations. And finally, to close, I was actually talking to a mentee about kind of not giving up and learning over time. It can be really, really difficult, but you kind of just need to persevere. And he reminded me of this Bruce Lee quote: "I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times." You need to learn how to prioritize. You don't need to do everything at once. Start with one kick a day. If you're sitting here saying, I need to completely revamp my portfolio, I need to redo my resume, maybe you want to redo a case study, maybe you just kind of are good. But either way, take it slow. Focus on, your case study. That's really important. Get that set. When that's set, decide if you want to move to your second one, or if you would better be spending your time working on your resume. Prioritize, take it slow. You'll learn over time and eventually you'll get it. So just keep persevering. Learn as you go. So design thinking, pay attention to the process. Don't be upset when you get rejected. It happens. Just make sure you learn from it and bring it to your next interviewing so that you don't make those same mistakes. That's what UX is all about. And then never give up, right? Getting rejected can be hard. And I just looked at my own LinkedIn profile and I've applied to 152 applications through LinkedIn. I've only received 3 offers, a 2% success rate. I've been rejected a lot, way more than I would like to talk about. And this is only on LinkedIn. But just keep trying, apply this design thinking methodology, and it will allow you to improve not only your interviewing skills, but just generally as a designer over time. So be confident, keep trying, and don't give up. Thank you for your time. Feel free to reach out and say hello on LinkedIn.